The first of them has already been discussed in the last panel, and that is trying to harmonize the proliferation of protocols for analysis. You'll hear in other panels more of the details about the draft guidance issued by the U.S. Council on Environmental Quality under NEPA by way of full disclosure. And to give you a sense of my own biases here, I should tell you that I was the lawyer for the Natural Resources Defense Council in filing the petition with CEQ in 2008, asking it to come out with such guidance. But you'll have more details on the contents of it later. There are also, as you know, guidances that have already emerged in several of the U.S. states. California and New York, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Washington State all have their own protocols. Quite a few local rules have emerged. The air quality control districts in California, of the Bay Area, of San Joaquin Valley, of Sacramento, and the South Coast, several others. New York City just released its important guidance a few months ago. The city of Orange, California, King County, Washington, and several others. As the people here know much better than I, several other countries have released those. We have tried to post all the protocols we have found on the website of the Columbia Center for Climate Change Law, which is www.columbiaclimatelaw.com. And if there are additional protocols that we haven't posted, I would be most grateful if you could send them to me so that we could go ahead and post them there. But having them all available in one place is obviously only the first step in trying to harmonize them, and clearly the IAIA has a major potential role in doing that. The second major thing that needs to be done is that the climate-related information that is gathered through other legal or legally required processes needs to be somehow harmonized with the data that is gathered under the impact assessment process. In the U.S., the U.S. EPA greenhouse gas disclosure rules are now in effect. As of January of 2010, about 10,000 entities, mostly industries but not exclusively, needed to start monitoring their greenhouse gas emissions. They are going to have to report those to the U.S. EPA beginning in March of 2011. Much of that data will be publicly released, and at that point we will be awash in data on the greenhouse gas emissions of many different facilities. EPA is now in the process of requiring permits for, starting with large sources for greenhouse gas emissions. When those permit applications start coming in, and then when the monitoring reports on compliance with those permits come in, that will be an additional large amount of data. Earlier this year, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission released its guidance on reporting of climate issues in the securities filings by publicly traded companies. And so that is going to begin to generate a great deal of information. As others on this panel and later will discuss, there are a number of voluntary corporate disclosure requirements under the Carbon Disclosure Project and several others that are yielding a lot of information. Not often recognized, but the proceedings of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Public Utility Commissions of the 50 states yield a tremendous amount of data on energy supply and energy demand by regulated generators and transmission facilities, and that is a body of data that is too rarely linked into the impact assessment process. What a lot of this is generating is a grove of apple trees and orange trees, in the sense that we're going to see a great deal of apples and oranges comparisons about the impacts of and the emissions of different facilities because different protocols are being used. The third item on my list is that the climate-related information that is gathered under these disparate processes should be collected and posted online in a searchable way. There is no comprehensive online collection of environmental impact assessments. They can't be word searched in any comprehensive way, nor is there a geographic information system set up for the results of all this assessment. It is possible to go online and punch in an address and find out all the listed hazardous waste sites and reported spills and underground storage tanks and other contaminated land-related information about a particular site and a radius around that site. And that's very useful, but there's nothing comparable to that in the impact assessment world, and that would be tremendously useful. There's not even a comprehensive database that has all of the EISs themselves together. Again, in an effort to begin that, we've on our website posted the links to several hundred EISs prepared under NEPA and several hundred EIRs prepared under the California law, together with the links to them and the page references for their greenhouse gas discussion. So I think that's a helpful start, but it is nowhere near what is ultimately needed. Meanwhile, a large number of environmental impact statements that were prepared in the pre-electronic era on hard copy are being discarded, and a great deal of expensively gathered data is being irretrievably lost. And I would wish that someone would would put together a comprehensive physical collection of them and scan them so that they are all available. The fourth item is that while much of the focus of climate change analysis has been on the effect of actions on the climate, as we're going to be discussing in this conference, there needs to be at least as much focus on the adaptation side, on the effect of the climate on projects. And I'm sorry to say that I think as a result of congressional inaction on climate change and the emulation of that inaction by other countries that say if the historically largest greenhouse gas emitter is not going to take tough action, why should they? A consequence is that the adverse effects of climate change will get worse faster. And that the EISs for projects need to have a particularly close look at what these impacts are. This could begin to have liability consequences. There's a litigation going on right now in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, in which I'm not talking about the well-known public nuisance liability cases that are heading up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But this is litigation over whether a particular body of water called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, MRGO, called Mr. Go, was properly maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and if not, whether that worsened the damage from Hurricane Katrina. That is going through the federal courts, but there's a possibility of a multi-billion-dollar judgment against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for that. Going forward with other projects, there will be questions raised were there climate change related impacts that should have been anticipated in the design, and why weren't they reviewed if things go wrong. Number 5 is that that more serious attention, I think, needs to be and will be paid to worst case analysis. The Gulf spill shined a spotlight on the need to have a closer look at worst case events. I think one area will play out in particular sooner rather than later is the construction of new nuclear power plants in the United States. There are currently 19 applications pending before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for 30 units of nuclear power plants. Some of them are already beginning to work their way through the NEPA process. There is, as of last week, 1 final environmental impact statement, 6 draft EISs, 5 scoping summary results, and a number of others earlier in the process. If these projects become controversial and are subject to litigation, the worst case analysis that was or was not conducted as part of the impact review, I think, will be subject of litigation. Number 6, impact assessment should be recognized for the tremendous potential that it holds for improving energy efficiency and otherwise reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially when coupled with binding mitigation commitments. Several of the protocols that have been released, as you know, call for a listing of potential mitigation measures, and some of them require a justification for not picking any of the items on the list. This is going to pressure the applicants to try to adopt more measures, and very often energy efficiency is going to be the first and most readily available measure. This too will be subject to litigation. The draft Mitigation guidelines from CEQ counseled federal agencies to establish binding commitments for mitigating adverse environmental impacts identified in the NEPA process, and to enforce these commitments through the agency's existing legal authorities. This draft CEQ guidelines also call for ensuring monitoring and implementation of the effectiveness of mitigation measures, and to make all of this information available to the public. That ties in with the next item, which is that during the implementation phase, we need to, from time to time, revisit the conclusions in EISs and reassess whether they still comport with reality. The NEPA process is, of course, oriented to decisions on specific actions, and once the decision is made, often the EIS is put on the shelf. During subsequent years, as the project is implemented, much new information may become known about the impacts and the environmental setting, but typically the NEPA process and most of the other impact assessment processes would be over by then. And so particularly as the implementation of mitigation commitments is carried out and monitoring, it may be necessary to devise a process for reopening some of the NEPA review. Number 8 is the central importance of water demands, and water consumption needs to receive special attention as part of the process. The principal impact of climate change, at least in the short term, will be on water. Too much in some places, too little on others. In others. A lot of attention has been paid to direct and indirect energy demands. I think increasing attention is going to be paid to the direct and indirect water impact of projects. Just a few days ago, the Carbon Disclosure Project announced that it was going to undertake a water disclosure project, and I think this is a harbinger of things to come with increased attention paid to water impacts. And the final item on my list is that ways need to be found to expedite the review of renewable energy projects, or some of the public support for environmental impact review may be eroded. Many of the supporters of vigorous environmental impact review are also supporters of greatly expanding the supply of renewable energy in the United States. And impact review, together with certain substantive requirements such as the Endangered Species Act, are increasingly posing obstacles to the construction of new renewable energy facilities. So I think attention needs to be paid to how to reconcile those two conflicting environmental objectives. So these are all significant challenges, but they must be met if impact assessment is to fulfill its potential as a tool to help in fighting climate change, and the people in this room will clearly be in the forefront of that effort. Thank you.